Much of what we've covered in the Age of Exploration deals primarily with the Spanish and the Portuguese. This is because they really led the way in the exploration of the Americas and, for that matter, Asia during the Age of Exploration. But of course, they were not all the only players on the world map and the only kingdoms interested in exploring and conquering the world. Today we're going to focus primarily on the English and the role they played in the Age of Exploration. And as we look at the role they played, we're going to start by looking at what did the nation of England look like during the Age of Exploration? What was their culture like? And as we do that, we're going to address three primary questions. The first is, how did the English Reformation differ, or how was it different, from the European Reformation? In other words, how does England change during the Middle Ages in ways that are different than the way Europe, Germany, France, Spain, change during the Middle Ages into the Age of Exploration? Number two, what happened and why with England's first failed attempts at colonization? We'll talk about two different attempts that are going to fail. One with a man by the name of Giovanni Caboto, and the other with the colony of Roanoke. And three, how did English religious conflict and the resulting political philosophies impact the developing political ideas of the Americas? Now, these notes are going to correspond to your workbook, to the pages that look like this. Those are pages, and the page number is off the bottom, but it's on starts on 111. And you'll be doing 111, which is right here, 112, page 113 and 114, page 115 and 116. There's a number of mapping activities you'll do in this section. Page 117 and 118. There's a textbook assignment that you'll be doing here. In fact, there's two textbook assignments in this section you're doing. There's a movie section you'll be doing, and you'll end that assignment in your workbook on page 118. So that's where the notes will correspond to. If you're not yet in your workbook, pause this clip and go to your workbook so you can follow along as I teach the content that you'll need to have. Okay, so let's start then with the story of Henry VII. Henry VII is called the father of the kings, or father of kings, primarily because so many powerful English monarchs will look back at him as their father or grandfather or great-grandfather. He's the father of both the Tudor and the Stuart line, which are going to rule England for, gosh, almost 200 years. Now I want you to start by looking at the date on the top of the page, 1485 to 1509. Ask yourself, who have we studied who lives during this same time period? Come up with a list in your head of some people who we have studied who lived during the same time period. Okay, some of the names you might have thought of: Martin Luther would have lived or been a contemporary of Henry VII. John Calvin, Ferdinand and Isabel. Gutenberg would have passed away shortly before Henry VII was born. So he's living during this time of powerful European explorers and monarchs like Ferdinand and Isabel or Christopher Columbus. But he's also living at this time when has been some revolutionary change that's occurring or starting to occur in Europe. Not only is he going to see revolutionary changes in Europe, he's going to see major changes in his country as well. Henry VII came to the throne, or became the monarch, following what is known as the War of the Roses. It was a civil war between two parts of Henry VII's family. The Tudor, so if Henry had a last name, it would be Tudor, Henry VII, who was a Tudor, and the Lancasterians, who will also be known as the House of York. And these two families will go on into a civil war that will last for a long period of time, and it will end when Henry VII will kill his first cousin, Richard III, who is the Yorkish king or the Lancasterian king, and then Henry VII unites all of England. And one of his first goals, once he unites the kingdom of England, is to unify it and increase the power of the king. So let's take just a second. I want you to pause from your note-taking here and we're going to do a textbook assignment. Now this textbook assignment corresponds in your workbook to the bottom of page 111, and in the textbook you're going to go to page 84 in the American history textbook. So that's the red and white textbook. If you're doing this assignment at home, a copy of these readings is available on the website, so you can download it and see it on the website as well. But I'd like you to take a few minutes, pause the video, and you'll be reading in your textbook on page 84 in the American history textbook, the section that starts with the English Southwest, and it ends, it's about 5 paragraphs. It ends with the French piece. Once you've read those 5 paragraphs, answer these 6 questions that you see on your screen, and that's in your workbook. When you're done with that, come back to the lecture, so you can restart the lecture and continue from there. Okay, so if you can't find the readings of the textbook, or as I indicated before, if you're doing this at home, the readings are available on the class website. If you'll go to the class website, nesshistory.org, go to the current unit. Once you go into that current unit, you're going to go to Film, Movie Clips. No, is that right? Oh, no, excuse me, American History Readings from Textbook, right up here. We'll open that up, and you'll find the assignment. Right here, it's page 84 and 85. Open that up right there. And, oh gosh, looks like we're on the side over here. Let me open this up so you can see it better. And you'll be doing the English Southwest right here to the bottom of that page to your next page, which you're going to go back, and that starts on 85. So once you've done 84, you'll read 85. Again, it is on the website, and you're going to read that section to the bottom where it says the French in the Northwest Passage. So you'll stop right there. Once you're done, return to the film clip. Okay, we're going to assume you're done with the assignment. Let me give you a little bit of background on the family of Henry VIII. This actually corresponds to page 1, or excuse me, Henry VII, corresponds to page 112. And as we do that, we're going to connect somewhat these two families. So we already know Ferdinand and Isabel. You'll remember that Ferdinand and Isabel are the monarchs who funded the voyage of Christopher Columbus. Ferdinand and Isabel had 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 children. Now, 2 of these children, Juan, who is going to be the Prince of Asturias, which is a region in Spain, and would have become the King of Spain had he lived. Juan marries a Portuguese princess. Ferdinand and Isabel are trying to consolidate their power in Iberia, but globally, because if you'll remember with the Treaty of Tordesillas, Portugal got the other half of the world. So this would have been a very powerful merging of 2 families and 2 kingdoms. Fortunately or unfortunately, however you look at it, Juan dies before he and the Portuguese princess have a bride. His parents will then again continue to try to build that kingdom by marrying Isabella off to the King of Portugal. She too dies before having a child, and so continuing that, they will marry their child Maria off to Manuel the Fortunado, or Manuel the Fortunate, who is the grandson of Prince Henry the Navigator, who we studied earlier, the King of Portugal. And they will have a daughter, Princess Isabella, who for a short time will become the Empress of the Holy Roman Empire. Maria and her husband Manuel will fund the voyage of Vasco da Gama. You'll remember that Vasco da Gama was the first one to go down and around Africa to India. So these are very, very powerful monarchs. Now if we go over here to their 4th daughter, so far we've studied all of this stuff. Their 4th daughter was named Juana. Juana will become known as Juana la Loca. She was considered mentally unstable by many of her peers. And perhaps with good reason. Juana's husband, so Juana was married off to the German or the Austrian prince. He too had a large empire, and he will eventually become king of the Holy Roman Empire, a very, very powerful empire, which was Austria, Switzerland, the Germany's, Netherlands, portions of what we know as France today, and portions of what we know as Italy today. Their son, who will be an extraordinarily powerful monarch, would be Charles, and their grandson is Philip I. the the kingdom of Ferdinand and Isabel will actually be inherited through this line, because this is our first male heir, Charles the First. Charles the First. So here is Juana. This is her husband, Philip of Austria. As I indicated before, Juana is known as Juana la Loca. The legend says that Juana was deeply in love with her husband Philip, and he died early in their marriage. She had a child, and then 7 years into their marriage, he passed away and died, and Juana never really recovered from that. As I said before, there was a legend wrapped around her that she had her husband's body preserved, mummified, and then he wasn't buried, but she would take his casket. It was kind of an open casket, and as she went on progress, or when she stayed in the castle, she would have the casket brought into her room, and at night she would open up the casket every night and kiss him good night, and would talk to him as if he had lived, and she'll live into old age, continuing to mourn Philip of Austria. Interesting story, but not really important in the story we're telling. Their son is, so Philip and Juana will fund the conquistadors. Their son Charles, who's extraordinarily powerful, will reign over the Americas, Spain, Germany, Italy, and Austria. In our last unit, we talked about the war, the 30-year war in Germany, and the money that was spent on those battles between in the Reformation and Counter-Reformation. That was funded largely by Charles I, the heir to Ferdinand and Isabel. So here's where the power is going right here. And then their son will be Philip. Now, where I want to tell you the story today is not of this monarchy, but it's through this line right here, Catherine, their fifth daughter. Catherine will marry Henry. Well, there's two people she's going to marry, but the one that really matters here is Henry VIII. Henry VIII is the son of Henry VII, right up here. So if we go back to our previous slide, had a picture on the front. This is a contemporary painting, a primary document. It was painted by someone who lived at the time of Henry VII. And this picture shows the kingdoms that will come through Henry VII, who rules in England. One of these kingdoms will be through his son, right here, Henry VIII. Now there are additional kingdoms that are shown here and powers that are shown here, but you'll notice there are 2 sons and 2 daughters. So I'm going to tell you the story today of, we're going to start with Henry VII, and then we'll move on toward Henry VIII and what he does to push European or English exploration. Okay, so let's make the transition from Henry VII becoming King of England, attempting to explore and colonize in the Americas, and then stopping when things fell for him. It was very costly. One of the things the textbook did not make clear is that the voyages that Henry VII funds for John Cabot are extraordinarily costly. On that second voyage, when the ships are lost at sea, that would be the equivalent of losing a space shuttle. These were very expensive ships for their time period. They were $1 million ships, and so, as you read about in the text, he'll stop exploration, and instead he'll try to unify England through marriage, which would be traditional practice. So he's going to marry his oldest son off. And you think back to this chart we just looked at. Where is the power in 1492? Well, certainly the most powerful monarch and the most powerful kingdom would be that of Spain, Ferdinand and Isabel. So what he wants to do is marry his children off to a powerful empire. And where he's going to look to is going to be to England. So we're going to look right over here to this daughter, Catherine, right here. And I'm going to tell you the story of Catherine of Aragon, the 5th daughter of Ferdinand and Isabel. So on the right, you see a picture of Catherine, Catherine of Aragon. She was the daughter of Ferdinand and Isabel. This picture, a drawing, it's a contemporary drawing, so it was probably fairly true to life. She had dark blonde hair, and as an infant, she was affianced, she was engaged to the young Arthur. Now, Arthur was Henry VII's oldest child. The mother was Elizabeth of York. Arthur, like Catherine, same age. They were both children, 2-3 years old when they were affianced. But Arthur was a very kind of a weakly unhealthy child. Catherine, on the other hand, was healthy and strong. Catherine was the daughter of Isabel, and it's said in her own accounts with her ladies in waiting that she remembered. She talked with her ladies in waiting about remembering her mother going into Granada and capturing the Alhambra from the Moors, and her mother dressed in a suit of armor riding before the troops as a little girl, her mommy kissing her goodbye as she went off to battle in a suit of armor. So Catherine was a strong, healthy, powerful woman. And as a little girl, she was engaged to Arthur. Arthur, you see on the left. At 15, the age of 15, she is brought to England, where she's formally married to the young Arthur. Her brother-in-law, Henry VIII, who at that point was 10 years old, he was 5 years younger than her, is asked to walk her down the aisle to marry her brother. And by all accounts, including Henry's, he saw Catherine as beautiful, and the little brother actually had a little crush on his sister-in-law. They are then married, and they're sent off to Wales to begin their family. The entire line and the success of the War of Roses and Henry VII keeping England unified, monarchy powerful, relies upon these two having children. So they're sent off to go do that. They go to Wales, they get married, and they move away. Shortly after they are married, Arthur passes away, and Catherine is left as a 15-year-old widow under the power of her father-in-law, Henry VII. Henry VII actually tries, his wife, Elizabeth of York, passed away, and Henry VII actually tried to negotiate with Ferdinand and Isabel for his daughter-in-law's hand in marriage, and Ferdinand and Isabel kiboshed that idea, not necessarily because they love their daughter, which they may have, but largely because he already had another son, and the bloodline, the monarchy, would have come through that other son. Right after Henry VII dies, Arthur's second son, Henry VIII, who you see on the left, becomes engaged to. He is only 18 at the time. Catherine is 23, and they are married. This is the marriage that most people know about. Most people don't realize that Catherine was married to Arthur before she married Henry VIII. Now, I want to point out that I'm now going to go into the story of Henry VIII, which is really the English Reformation. At the end of this section, you will be asked to do a short summary. This is on page 114. So perhaps as you are underlining and taking notes in your textbook here, you might want to write down some of the key ideas, individuals, events, or ideas that come from this text, so you can write your summary when we're done. But just be aware of that as I'm doing the lecture here. So, Henry VIII was crowned king in 1509. He was only 19 years old. The picture you see on the screen, it's not a great photo, but it's because it's a picture of a tapestry. So the pixel quality is really the tapestry, the weaving on that. If you'll notice right here in the center, that is Catherine of Aragon at the age of 23. And this is Henry VIII, and they're doing a jousting tournament at the time of their wedding. This tapestry is also a primary document, and it shows the wedding is, they're kind of showing off for each other. As I indicated before, Henry VIII allies England with Spain through marriage. It's a marriage alliance. And then as part of the Counter-Reformation, because Spain are the leaders in the Counter-Reformation, Ferdinand and Isabel are, well, actually Isabel's passed away. Ferdinand is still reigning as king, and he will die very, very shortly after Henry VIII and their daughter, Henry VIII and Catherine are married, and Charles will come to the throne in Spain. But through this alliance, Henry VIII allies his interests with Spain's interests, which means he is going to become involved in the Counter-Reformation, stopping the Protestants in Germany. So he will, shortly after the marriage in 1509, he will declare war on France as part of the Huguenot Wars. You'll remember that we talked about how in France they had a period of 50 years of intermittent warfare between Protestant Calvinists and Protestant Lutherans against Catholics. So Henry VIII will declare war, England then, declares war on France to go in and stop, the Protestants from taking over France. He wasn't super successful, but to thank him for his help and in recognition of what he did, the Pope will actually give Henry VIII the title Defender of the Faith. That title is actually going to come back to haunt the Pope because some of the things that Henry does, he's going to use that title in ways the Pope would certainly not have agreed with. Catherine and Henry VIII were married for 24 years. And the first 20 years of that marriage appears to be a pretty good marriage. She was older than him, but not by a number of years, 5 years. They would have somewhat grown up together. The most difficult thing in their marriage was that Catherine had a very difficult time sustaining her pregnancies. She had a number of miscarriages. She had several dead infants, meaning she gave birth to at least 3 sons who make the record, and those sons die in infancy. With the 3 children that die, and then she has at least, that are on record, 4 miscarriages, some that are lost babies at as far as 7 months into the pregnancy. So that part would have been extraordinarily difficult. He does have one living daughter, Catherine and Henry VIII, and this is their daughter right here when she's younger. It is a contemporary painting, so it's very likely she looked someone like this. Her name was Mary Tudor. This painting was done when she was 15. It was also done at a period of her life where her life was about ready to fall apart. Because after 4 years of marriage, and after a number of miscarriages and dead infants, Henry will come to believe that he's being punished for marrying his dead brother's wife. It was based on a belief out of Leviticus that a man could not marry his brother's wife if that woman had relationships, sexual relationships with her first husband, so the first brother. And that gets into a whole other discussion we're not going to have right now on how that's interpreted at that time. But he's going to come to believe that he's being punished for marrying his dead brother's wife. He's also having not really an affair. He was in love with one of his wife's secretaries, or lady-in-waiting, and her name was Anne Boleyn. This is also a contemporary painting of Anne Boleyn at the time. Anne Boleyn was, she would have been 30 years younger. She was 19. And at this point, Catherine was, let me get my numbers correct here. She would have been about 50 years old. So big difference. And so Henry VIII was in love with Anne Boleyn. This all kind of fell into his plans because Henry's going to decide he wants to divorce his first wife, Catherine of Aragon, which is going to leave this little girl that we just talked about, Mary Tudor, in a bit of a mess, because right now she is the heir to the throne, and quite frankly, at the age of 15, she is promised to her first cousin, once removed, Charles I. So she's supposed to be marrying, no, it would be her first cousin, excuse me. She's supposed to be marrying Charles I, the Spanish heir. And if her parents get a divorce, who becomes the heir? And Henry still wants a son. He wants the Spanish monarch, or the English monarchy, to fall on an Englishman's head, not to go to a child of Mary and Charles who would be half Spanish. So the whole, falling in love with Anne Boleyn and feeling like he's being punished by God all falls into a bigger plan as well. So let me talk to you a little bit about Anne Boleyn. Anne Boleyn was a closet Calvinist. Now remember that England is Catholic, and before Anne Boleyn was even married, Henry VIII had fought the Calvinists in France. But Anne Boleyn had gone to England as a girl, had gone to France as a girl with Henry VIII's younger sister, who'd married a French king, Queen Mary. Living in the French court, Anne Boleyn had become a master at flirting, at the French art of love and being coy and flirtatious, etc. She'd also, as I indicated before, studied Calvinism. Now, you'll remember that when we studied the roots of Calvinism, that really what it comes down to is that Calvinists believe an individual is saved not by some kind of larger organization through ordinances, but that the individual is saved by their adherence and knowledge of the Bible. So it's individuals who reach up to save themselves through their relationship with God. It removes that higher authority. That's very, very different from the world and the mindset that Catherine of Aragon and Henry VIII will come from. So in the midst of this relationship, Henry's going to appeal to the Pope for a divorce. He's going to go to the Pope and request a divorce. Certainly it wouldn't be the first time a monarch had gotten a divorce, though divorce was considered illegal and immoral in Catholicism of the Renaissance era. Sometimes the rules are different for kings. However, this is not just a normal divorce. This isn't just, Jim asking Mary for a divorce. This is the King of England asking for a divorce from the Princess of Spain. And at this point, England didn't have the power of Spain. During the course of Henry's marriage to Catherine, Spain's power over the papacy had increased dramatically. As I indicated before, the heir to the Spanish throne is Charles V. That's the young man you see on the screen here. He was, without question, the most powerful person in all of Europe. He was Catherine's nephew, and he was affianced or promised to Mary Tudor. And the last thing he wants to see, I mean, he's building his life based on the fact that he's going to marry an English princess and unite the English and Spanish throne. He doesn't want to see this divorce because that means that there could then be a male heir to the throne, which means he doesn't inherit England. The male heir would be that one. And so he's going to intervene and try to stop the divorce. He will go so far as to kidnap the Pope, bring him into the Spanish Empire, and make it clear to the Pope that if he approves this divorce, that he will remove the power from the papacy, that he'll find a way to replace him with another Pope. And so the Pope, who is, of course, at that point dependent entirely, physically and, in other ways, I mean, who's leading the Counter-Reformation? The Spanish kings, Charles V. And the Counter-Reformation is what's fighting back. It's the way Catholics are fighting back to the Protestant Reformation. Charles would not allow the divorce of Catherine from his aunt, Henry VIII. What Henry does is remarkable, and it makes the English Reformation very, very different from the European Reformation. So when the Pope refused to grant Henry a divorce, Henry VIII, ironically using that same title that the Pope had given him of Defender of the Faith, said, okay, we quit. England is no longer a country that is Catholic. We are now part of the Church of England. He creates an entirely different church. It's a Christian church, and most of the doctrines are very, very similar to the Catholic Church. It is known today as the Anglican Church, or Church of England, and he names himself as head of the Church of England. And then he gives himself a divorce. This Reformation in England, extremely different from the European Reformation. Martin Luther, John Calvin, Erasmus, all of whom are part of that Reform movement, either purifying Catholicism from within or pulling out of Catholicism and becoming part of a Protestant movement. Those are all theological, religiously based, something that the Reformer did not agree with in doctrine. This Reformation is a political Reformation. The king is taking total power over the church. The king becomes the head of the church. It's no longer the Pope at the top of this pyramid of power. It is the king himself. And then he immediately married Anne, who actually at the time of the marriage was pregnant. He is convinced that because he has gone through all of this, that he will be blessed with a son. And so Anne and Henry VIII send out birth announcements throughout all of Europe to all of the other kings in Europe, announcing the birth of a son. And then, of course, it wasn't a son that was born, it was Elizabeth. This picture you see is of Elizabeth at a much older age, at the age of 13. And Elizabeth, both of these daughters, Elizabeth that you see right here, let me go back up again to his first daughter, Mary, excuse me. So both Mary and Elizabeth at different points will become monarchs in England. They're both extremely powerful women. However, the most powerful English monarch of all time is probably that little girl when she grows up. She becomes a very powerful monarch. So let's leave behind the church for a minute that he creates, and let's talk about what laws he's going to pass in England that are going to impact how England's going to change. One act he passes, which he creates, is called the Act of Submission. And it was an act which proclaimed the king had total authority in all of England. With this act, the king was head of the church, and the Pope could not pass judgment or excommunications that were valid in England for that. But with the Act of Submission, it means that all of the leaders of the Catholic Church in England had to formally renounce Catholicism and accept that the new bishop of the church or head of the church was the King of England. And of course, not all Catholics in England were willing to just, okay, new church, throw it out. And there are many devout Catholics who disagreed vehemently with what Henry VIII was doing. One of these men was a very good friend of his named Thomas More. And Sir Thomas More and Henry VIII had grown up together as boys. They'd actually learned to play tennis together. They were close friends. He was one of Henry VIII's closest advisors. When Henry VIII passes the Act of Submission, Sir Thomas More says, I can't sign that. You know, buddy, love you, you're my friend, but I cannot sign that. That is immoral. I believe in the Catholic Church. I believe in the power of the papacy, and I can't do that. You know, my morality, my conscience, my ethics won't allow me to sign that. Henry VIII is then put in the position of having to have one of his closest friends executed for not supporting the Act of Submission. I think, oh, here we go. Here's a picture. This is Sir Thomas More. In this Act of Submission of the clergy, Sir Thomas More was executed for treason in 1535. And you can see a picture of him, primary document. That's what he would have looked like when he refused to pledge his allegiance to the Church of England. They also passed an Act of Submission. So we've got the Act of Submission, now we've got the Act of Succession, which gave Anne's, any children that Anne would have, priority to the throne over any children that Catherine had. And in order to pass the Act of Succession, they had to legally invalidate or annul Henry's marriage to Catherine of Aragon. Kind of sounds a little strange, but they were legally able to say this marriage never occurred. Maybe these people had a child together. They don't get rid of Mary Tudor, but they say the marriage was not legitimate. And since the marriage was not a legitimate marriage, then that means that Mary Tudor, the little girl that we saw right up, where are you at, Mary? There we go. So Mary Tudor, at 15, was then illegitimized. And I apologize for the use of the word. It is the correct term. She's bastardized. So her birth is no longer considered a legitimate birth, which puts her at the end of the line for succession to the throne. So even though she's the oldest, any child that Anne Boleyn has will now, according to this Act of Succession, will be next in line to be the king or queen of England. But of course Henry VIII is not looking at either of his daughters. He's really thinking that he will have a child, another child through Anne Boleyn. A third act that Henry VIII passes is an act that takes all of the properties of the Catholic Church in England away from them and puts them in the hands of the king. So he'll take over monasteries, he'll take over cathedrals, he'll take over large farms that have been in the Catholic Church hands for 1,000 years. And with all of those new properties he brings in, the crown revenue, so the money that king brings in, will double for a few years. A number of those properties will actually be given to noblemen who support him in this Reformation. One of those properties is the one you see in the center, the picture in the center. This had been part of a Catholic monastery. It was taken away from the church, and it was given to Cardinal Wolsey, who was a Protestant leader, a friend of Henry VIII's, who helped, an advisor who helped lead the Protestant Reformation. And he took this monastery and then turned it into a private estate. On the right, it looks like a golf course, because it is a golf course. It too was a monastery that had belonged to the Catholic Church. It's in northern England, and it was turned over to a nobleman who, since that family has sold off that land, and it's now a golf course. Now that's politically or legally some of the changes that occur with this marriage. This marriage isn't going to last either. It's frankly, it began in dishonesty, and it's going to, the way this marriage begins is going to plague their relationship. King Henry and Queen Anne had been together for 7 years. 4 of those years were that period in time in which he's trying to get a divorce. So they're sweethearts, not married. 3 of those years as spouses. And the romance, at least for the king, is beginning to die. So, how to put this? When they were single, Anne was considered witty, and she had a quick response. She's that person who could always come up with one-liners, and it was funny and charming. Now that they're married, that wittiness just sounds like cattiness. And frankly, she doesn't trust her husband, and with, you know, good reason. I mean, he cheated on his first wife with her, and she's convinced that it's happening again. And in fact, it was, because he began to have feelings toward one of Anne's secretaries or ladies in waiting. And that's Jane Seymour. Jane Seymour, again, was considerably younger than Anne. She was 19 years old. And Anne had a number of enemies at the English court. A lot of people were very concerned by the upheaval they had seen in their country. They were concerned with the deaths of people like Sir Thomas More. And of course, he wasn't alone. Literally hundreds of devout Catholics were killed during this period. And they convinced the king that Anne was having a relationship. And so they call for an investigation on charges of treason. And why treason? Because she's the queen. She's the royal baby maker. And if she's taking a chance at having a baby with someone other than the king, then that heir wouldn't be legitimately the king's. And you could literally, I mean, you could slip somebody in there that's not the king's, and you can change the bloodline. So a queen having a relationship is an act of treason. On May 2nd, they're actually in Greenwich, England. This picture you see here is the Tower of London. King Henry rides out for the day, decides to go visit Jane Seymour. While he is out of the castle, soldiers come in and arrest Anne for treason. The formal charges are that of adultery, incest, and plotting to murder the king through witchcraft. She was imprisoned here in the Tower of London. You can see that on the right. And in fact, her prison tower, bring my mouse up so you can see it, would be that back tower right here. So she's imprisoned there in the Tower of London. And then on May 19th, so she's arrested on May 2nd, a trial is held, and 17 days later she is beheaded for treason. She's beheaded right back in the courtyard. If you could go down inside of that castle, when you look down inside of there, there's a big courtyard. She's beheaded right there for treason. Within 2 days of Anne's death, Henry remarries Jane Seymour. So first of all, let's make sure you understand the English Reformation. In a nutshell, the king is married to a Spanish princess. He wants a divorce. The Pope won't give him that divorce. So Henry reforms the church by making a new one and making him the head of it. That's really the English Reformation. It's the king taking over power of religion in his country. So let's finish what happens here in the move for power. As I said before, 2 days after he kills his third or second wife, he marries Queen Jane. This is Jane Seymour right here. This is actually from Madame Tussauds Wax Museum in London, but it's based on pictures of the time, and it's probably a pretty accurate depiction of what she might have looked like. Shortly after they're married, almost 9 months to the day, she gives birth to a little boy. This is him right here. Let's see if I've got a name. Nope, it's Prince Edward. Queen doesn't make it through the birthing. The accounts are pretty sketchy of this, but it appears that the baby was born breech. So instead of coming out head first, he was born his back pressing against the womb, so he couldn't come out, wouldn't move out of the uterus. And so because she was a queen, and this is kind of one of those weird things about the way they believed, even the doctor couldn't go inside of the womb and adjust the baby, move the baby so that he would come out head first. So it appears that they did a hysterectomy. They cut open the womb and removed the baby, cut open the uterus, removed the baby. But at that time period, there would have not been enough, they didn't have the medical expertise to do that. And she dies from complications during the birth. So now Henry has 3 children. He has a 20-year-old daughter, Mary, who has been illegitimatized. He has a daughter, Elizabeth, who would be, gosh, what would she be at this point? 5 years old? Something like that, 4 or 5 years old. And then he has a brand new son. Now, he may be the youngest, this little son, but he will inherit the throne over his 2 sisters because he's male. The picture you're looking at is actually the tomb of Henry VIII. His is on the right. I'll bring my mouse so you can see it right there. And he was buried. This is in St. George's Chapel at Windsor Castle. And that right there is Jane Seymour's. And within a 1-year period, all 3 of Henry's first 3 wives had died. Catherine of Aragon died 5 months before Anne, so she never knew what had happened with Anne, with the treason and being beheaded. Largely of undisclosed causes, the contemporary accounts, meaning at that time, people said she died of a broken heart. It was probably a heart attack. Catherine died 5 months before Anne. Anne, of course, had her head chopped off, and Jane died in childbirth. So now we have a king, we have 3 heirs, and just for quick fun, I'm going to tell you the story of his last 3 wives. None of these 3 are going to make any big difference in history, but it does make for a fun story. His 4th wife is a negotiated marriage. His ambassador sends artists throughout Europe, having them paint pictures of princesses, and he's going to choose his wife from the photographs or the paintings. This picture comes back of Anne of Cleves. She was a Lutheran princess from Germany. Cleves is a duchy or province in Germany. And he married her sight unseen. He'd only seen the picture. When she met him for the first time, she, not knowing he was the king, kind of mocked him unintentionally. Of course, he's getting older at this point. He's a pretty big guy. He would be, get my numbers straight here, he'd be 58, 60 years old, and we can tell by his suits of armor that at the time of his death he was grossly obese. He would have been well over 300 pounds. She was 19 years old. But when he married her, he thought she was too ugly, and she wisely negotiated a divorce contract. She outlived them all and got a little castle in England, and Mary Tudor, Princess Elizabeth, and little Edward, all 4 of them will call Anne of Cleves Aunt Anne the rest of their life. She just goes out and has a castle and lives happily ever after by herself. Because of how poorly this marriage worked out for Henry VIII, marrying what he thought was an ugly woman, this time he will marry a love for love again. She's 17. He at this point is much older than that. And this next wife is Catherine Howard. She's a little girl. 20 years is probably incorrect. She's more like 30 years younger than the king. It was Anne Boleyn's first cousin. Some irony there. And she did actually get caught in the act of having an affair, so that's very much treason. And she will be beheaded in the same courtyard where her first cousin Anne Boleyn is beheaded. So she's killed. And then his last wife, who will outlive him, was herself a widow, meaning she'd been married before. She marries Henry VIII, and she'll outlive him. She cares for him a little bit as he's getting older, and she will raise Elizabeth I. So those are the 6 wives of King Henry VIII. And they will be divorced, executed, died in childbirth, divorced, executed, outlive him. That's kind of the story of those wives and of the English Reformation. In the process of all these 6 women, Henry VIII is going to change England forever. And, of course, the Americas. Through those wives, he will have 3 children. One on the left is Mary, Mary Tudor, daughter of Catherine, devoutly Catholic. In the center, on the left of Henry VIII, is his son, Edward. He is Protestant through Jane Seymour. Now, the artist has actually painted Jane Seymour. So Jane Seymour was dead at this time. This picture was painted while they were all alive. That's Jane Seymour, but she would have been dead at this point. She died in his birth. But the artist, or Henry, wanted his wife, Jane Seymour, painted into this painting. I've always wondered, how did Catherine Parr feel about that? You know, he's married to Catherine Parr, but he has his dead wife painted in the picture. It's kind of weird. And then, of course, Elizabeth. Over here is Elizabeth, the daughter of Anne. So we have a Catholic and 2 Protestants who are heir to the throne. Each of those children will become kings and queens in their own right. None will have their own children. So I want you to think right now. We've got a Catholic, devoutly Catholic, and 2 Protestant heirs to the throne. What do you think the consequences might be for England as they move into the next century, into the 1600s, or into the mid-1500s? Think about that for a minute. Okay, so as we conclude our lecture on the English Reformation, the role that Henry VII in the Age of Exploration, and then the story of Henry VIII and how that's going to lead to the English Reformation, you'll remember that when I started this, I said back on page 114, when we're done with this discussion, I'm going to ask you to complete a summary. So retell this story. Include the key people from the beginning. So go back to Henry VII, include John Cabot, and tell the story of how Henry VIII, from father to son, is going to change the nature of England and bring the Reformation, the Protestant Reformation, to England.